The air inside the cantina was thick enough to cut with a vibroblade. Purple smoke from a dozen different species recreational drugs mixed with the steam rising from exotic meals that would kill most carbon-based life forms. Station Omega-7 sat at the crossroads of three major trade routes, making it a melting pot of the galaxy's most desperate souls. Zixthara had been nursing the same glass of synthol for the past hour, watching the amber liquid swirl as she tilted the cup. The Keltharian veteran's exoskeleton bore the telltale signs of a soldier who had seen too much action. Plasma burns created zigzag patterns across her chitinous chest plate, while a missing segment of her left antenna spoke of a close call with a fusion grenade. Her four compound eyes, each the size of a human fist, reflected the cantina's dim lighting like black mirrors. The background noise was typical for this kind of establishment. A Rigelian trader argued loudly with a Centaurian merchant about shipping rates, their universal translators crackling with static. Near the bar, a group of off-duty miners from the asteroid belt were celebrating their latest haul, their laughter echoing off the metal walls. In the corner, a lone figure in a hooded cloak sat perfectly still, the kind of stillness that suggested either deep meditation or careful observation. Zixthara had chosen this table specifically because it gave her a clear view of all entrances, while keeping her back to the reinforced wall. Old habits died hard, and in her line of work paranoia was what kept you breathing. She had been coming to this cantina for 3 months now, ever since her discharge from the Keltharian Defense Force. The synthetic alcohol helped dull the edge of memories that cut like shattered glass. The veteran was just signaling the bartender for another round when she noticed them. 5 young Zephyrians had entered the cantina, their blue skin practically glowing with excitement and nervous energy. Their bioluminescent patches pulsed in synchronized patterns, a dead giveaway that they were fresh recruits still learning to control their emotional responses. Everything about them screamed inexperience, from their perfectly pressed uniforms to the way they kept glancing around the cantina like tourists. Zixthara cursed under her breath. She recognized the look in their large dark eyes. It was the same look she had once worn, back when she thought war was glorious and death was something that happened to other people. The youngest of the group, barely out of his molt by the look of him, kept pointing in her direction and whispering to his companions. "Great," she muttered, taking another sip of her drink. "Here we go." The group approached her table with the kind of cautious reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. The youngest Zephyrian, who couldn't have been more than 20 standard years old, stepped forward first. His patches flickered nervously as he cleared his throat. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Are you veteran Zixthara, from the 47th Keltharian Shock Division?" Zixthara's mandibles clicked once, a sound that could have been acknowledgement or warning. "Depends who's asking." "I'm Recruit Vexali," the young Zephyrian continued, his enthusiasm overriding his nervousness. "These are my squad mates. We're shipping out to the Outer Rim tomorrow morning, and we heard you served in the Terran Wars. We were wondering if you could tell us what real combat is like." The veteran's 4 eyes focused on the young soldiers with laser intensity. She could see herself in their eager faces, remembering when she had been just as naive, just as hungry for glory. The cantina's noise seemed to fade as she studied them, noting their soft hands that had never gripped a weapon in anger, their unmarked skin that had never felt the kiss of plasma fire. "You don't want to know, hatchlings," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 battles. "Trust me on this one. Go find yourselves some nice, safe desk jobs. The galaxy has enough heroes." But the recruits weren't so easily discouraged. Another one, slightly older than the first, stepped forward. His patches were glowing brighter now, betraying his excitement. "Please, veteran, we've heard stories about the Terran Wars, about how fierce the fighting was, how the humans fought like demons. They say you were there when the 47th held the line at Kepler Station." Zixthara's grip tightened on her glass. The mention of Kepler Station sent a familiar chill down her spine, the kind that came with memories too painful to fully remember, but too important to forget. She had been trying to drink away those particular ghosts for months now, but they kept coming back, usually in her dreams. "Stories," she repeated, her voice flat. "That's all they are to you, isn't it? Just stories." The recruits exchanged glances. uncertain how to respond to the veteran's sudden shift in mood. The cantina's atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, as if the very air was pressing down on them. Even the other patrons seemed to sense something was happening, their conversations dropping to whispers. Zixthara drained her glass in one gulp, the synthetic alcohol burning her throat. She set the empty container down with a sharp click that echoed in the sudden quiet. Her four eyes swept over the young faces before her, taking in their expectant expressions, their barely contained excitement. "The Terran Wars," she said slowly, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "You want to know about the Terran Wars?" She gestured to the empty chairs around her table with one chitinous claw. The recruits quickly sat down, leaning forward eagerly. The veteran looked at each of them in turn, her expression unreadable. "Sit down, younglings," she said, her voice carrying a new edge. "Let me tell you about the humans." The cantina had grown quieter as other patrons began to notice the conversation at Zixthara's table. The veteran's claws traced patterns on the metal surface as she gathered her thoughts, her four eyes distant with memory. "Kepler 442b was nothing special to look at," she began, her voice taking on the tone of someone reliving a nightmare. "A dusty rock orbiting a red dwarf star, barely worth the fuel to get there. The humans had set up a research station there, studying some kind of mineral deposits. Our intelligence said it was a soft target, maybe 50 scientists and technicians. No military presence, no defense systems worth mentioning." She paused to signal the bartender for another drink. The young Zephyrian recruits hung on her every word, their bioluminescent patches pulsing with anticipation. "Command assigned the 47th Shock Division to take the facility. 300 of our best soldiers, plus orbital support from the Dreadnought. Carrickstal." I was a squad leader then, still believing in quick victories and easy glory. Her mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. "We dropped from orbit at dawn, expecting to be back on the ship by lunch." The drink arrived, and Zixthara took a long sip before continuing. "The research facility was built into the side of a mountain, with only one main entrance and a few service tunnels. Perfect for a siege, though we didn't know it at the time. Our scanners showed 57 life signs inside, just like intelligence had said." One of the recruits, a female named Kiralon, leaned forward. "What happened when you demanded surrender?" "That's when we met Director De Hyun," Zixthara said, her voice carrying a mix of respect and old anger. "He wasn't even military, just a civilian scientist who happened to be in charge. When our commander sent the surrender demand, this human comes on the comm channel, and you know what he says?" The recruits shook their heads eagerly. "He laughs. Actually laughs at us. Then he says in perfect Keltharian, 'You want our research, come and take it.' The comm goes dead, and suddenly every window in that facility lights up with weapon fire." Zixthara's eyes seemed to glow brighter as she remembered. Turns out these helpless scientists had been busy. They'd turned their mining lasers into anti-personnel weapons, rigged their geological charges into bombs, and somehow managed to hack into our tactical network. Within the first hour, we lost 20 soldiers to weapons that shouldn't have existed. In the veteran's voice grew more intense. "There was this one human, a scientist named Boram. She was a chemist, studied rock formations or something equally boring. But when the shooting started, she started mixing laboratory chemicals into explosives that could punch through our armor. She'd pop up in different sections of the facility, drop her homemade bombs, and disappear back into the ventilation system, like some kind of ghost." The recruits were completely absorbed now, their drinks forgotten. Zixthara continued, her voice painting vivid pictures of the siege. The humans had divided their facility into defensive zones, each one more deadly than the last. A young technician named Hyunwoo held the main corridor for 6 hours straight, with nothing but a plasma cutter and an emergency shield generator. 6 hours, by himself. He welded blast doors shut behind him as he fell back, turning every meter of tunnel into a killing field. She paused, remembering the horror of trying to advance through those corridors. The worst part was how smart they were. They didn't just fight, they adapted. Every time we figured out their tactics, they changed them. When we brought in heavy armor, they started using acid from their labs to eat through the joints. When we tried to gas them out, they had already sealed the ventilation systems and switched to emergency oxygen. The cantina's background noise seemed to fade as Zixthara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. By day 23, we had lost over 100 soldiers. Command was getting angry, demanding results. We finally breached their outer perimeter, using plasma charges, and I got my first real look at their leader. Her claws scraped against the table, leaving small grooves in the metal. Dai Hyun was standing in the main laboratory, directing the defense. Half his face was burned from a plasma blast. His left arm was in a makeshift sling and there was dried blood on his lab coat. But his eyes were still burning with determination. He was coordinating their defense using nothing but hand signals and whispered commands. One of the younger recruits, Vexali, spoke up. How were they still fighting after 3 weeks? That's what we couldn't understand, Zixthara replied. Their medical supplies should have run out in the first week. Their food stores couldn't have lasted more than 10 days. But somehow, they kept going. There was this medic, a woman named Su Jin, who was treating wounded soldiers with equipment that belonged in a geology lab. She was using mineral scanners as diagnostic tools and crystalline samples as surgical implements. The veteran's voice took on an almost mystical quality. But the strangest thing was the singing. When the fighting got intense, when our artillery was pounding their positions and our soldiers were pushing through their defenses, you could hear them singing. Old songs from Earth, melodies I'd never heard, but somehow understood. The sound would echo through the facility's corridors, this beautiful, haunting music that made your blood run cold. She shuddered slightly, the memory still affecting her after all these years. It wasn't just noise or propaganda, it was something deeper, something that spoke to the very core of who they were. Even as they were dying, even as their facility was being torn apart around them, they kept singing. It was like they were telling us that we could take their lives, but we could never take their spirit. The recruits sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they were hearing. The idea of civilians fighting trained soldiers for weeks on end seemed impossible, yet the conviction in Zixthara's voice made it real. "How did it end?" Kirillon asked quietly. Zixthara's expression darkened. On day 47, our sensors picked up human ships approaching the system, not rescue vessels or negotiation craft, warships, military vessels with enough firepower to turn the entire planet into glass. We thought they were coming to save their people. She drained her glass. Completely. We were wrong. The humans hadn't come to negotiate or evacuate. They had come to make sure that none of us survived to report what we had seen, what 57 human civilians had done to 300 of our best soldiers. The siege ended not because we won, but because the humans decided that some secrets were worth dying for. The cantina remained quiet for a long moment, the weight of the veteran's words settling over the table like a heavy blanket. The young recruits looked at each other uncertainly, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by something closer to fear. The bartender, a 6-armed Altarian with scarred blue skin, slid another glass of synthol across the table without being asked. He had been listening to the conversation and recognized the look in the veteran's eyes. Some stories demanded to be told, and some required liquid courage to get through them. Zixthara wrapped her claws around the glass, watching the amber liquid catch the cantina's flickering lights. The young Zephyrian recruits waited in tense silence, their bioluminescent patches now pulsing in subdued patterns. The atmosphere in the cantina had shifted completely. Even the rowdy miners had quieted down, sensing the weight of what was being shared. After Kepler 442b, everything changed, the veteran continued, her voice carrying a new edge of bitterness. High Command realized they had underestimated the humans. No more small operations, no more assuming easy victories. They assembled the largest fleet in Keltharian history. 5,000 ships, including 12 dreadnoughts, and the pride of our navy, the Eternal Dominion. She took a sip of her drink, letting the alcohol burn away some of the pain that came with the memories. The target was the Sol asteroid belt, human mining operations, supply depots, and most importantly, their main shipyard facilities. Intelligence said if we could take the belt, we could cut off Earth's industrial capacity and force a surrender. One of the recruits, a young male named Kextar, shifted nervously in his seat. "But the humans knew you were coming." "Oh, they knew," Zixthara confirmed with a bitter laugh. Admiral Jae-sung had been expecting us for weeks. The man was a legend, even among our own tactical officers. Never lost a battle in 30 years. Of service. He had maybe 800 ships, mostly fighters and light cruisers. We outnumbered them 5-1, outgunned them 10-1. The veteran's 4 eyes grew distant as she recalled the scene. When our fleet dropped out of hyperspace, the asteroid belt looked like a swarm of angry insects. Human ships moving in complex patterns between the rocks, using the asteroids as cover and weapons. But we could see right through their strategy. This wasn't about winning a battle anymore. This was about buying time. She paused, her mandibles clicking as she remembered the opening moments of the engagement. Our sensors detected massive civilian evacuations from Earth. Thousands of transport, ships fleeing the inner system, heading for colonies in distant sectors. The humans weren't trying to defend their territory. They were trying to save their people. The cantina had grown completely silent now. Even the background hum of the station's life support systems seemed muted. Zixthara continued, her voice painting vivid pictures of the battle that had haunted her dreams for years. The first wave of attacks came from nowhere. Human fighters would rocket out from behind asteroids, hit our formation, and disappear again before we could respond. A pilot named Tai-min caught our attention early. His ship was already damaged, plasma leaking from his engines, but he kept coming back for more attacks. Her claws tightened around the glass. I was on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion when it happened. Tai-min's fighter had taken a direct hit from our point defense systems. The ship was spinning out of control, his life support was failing, and his weapons were offline. Any sane pilot would have ejected or tried to reach friendly lines. The recruits leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story. Instead, he used his last thruster burst to line up with our flagship's bridge. Just before impact, his comm channel crackled to life. He was singing, some kind of human battle song. The words were in their language, but you could hear the determination in his voice. Then his fighter punched through our primary command deck like a spear through paper. Zixthara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. 12 officers died in that collision, including our fleet commander. But Tai-min wasn't alone. All across the battlefield, human pilots were making the same choice. They would use their damaged ships as weapons, ramming our vessels with a precision that our tactical computers couldn't calculate. She took another drink, steadying herself for what came next. There was another pilot, a woman named Mi-sun. Her squadron was covering the withdrawal of a damaged human cruiser when they got caught by 20 of our interceptors. Her wingmen were shot down one by one, but she refused to retreat. The veteran's eyes seemed to glow brighter as she remembered. For 15 minutes, Mi-sun held off the entire enemy formation by herself. She was flying a light fighter against 20 military interceptors, using the asteroid field like a 3-dimensional maze. Every time we thought we had her cornered, she would appear somewhere else, taking out another of our ships. Kekstar interrupted, his voice filled with disbelief. 1 fighter against 20 interceptors. That's impossible. That's what I thought. 2, Zixthara replied. But I watched it happen. She wasn't just flying, she was dancing. Her ship moved through space like it was part of her body, responding to threats before our sensors could even detect them. When her fighter finally went down, she had destroyed 8 of our interceptors and damaged 5 more. The veteran's expression grew even darker. But the worst part was when we started boarding their larger vessels. We expected the usual surrender protocols once we breached their hulls. Instead, we found something else entirely. She paused, letting the suspense build. The recruits were hanging on her every word now, their earlier excitement replaced by a growing sense of dread. The human Marines fought us in their own corridors with a ferocity that defied explanation. When they couldn't hold a position, they would detonate their own life support systems rather than let us capture the ship intact. So a sergeant named Dongwook sealed himself in the engineering section of a human destroyer and triggered a reactor overload that killed half our boarding party. Zixthara's mandibles clicked in what might have been admiration or horror. These weren't soldiers following orders. These were people who had made a conscious choice to die rather than let us win. Every corridor we took was paid for in blood, and every victory felt like a defeat. The climax of her story came with the memory that had haunted her most. Near the end of the battle, Admiral Jae-sung's flagship was surrounded, his engines were destroyed, his weapons were offline, and his crew was down to less than half strength. Any other commander would have surrendered. She drained her glass completely before continuing. Instead, he opened a channel to the entire fleet, both human and Keltharian. His voice was calm, almost peaceful. He said, "We are the line between the darkness and the dawn. We hold." Then he used his ship's emergency thrusters to ram our command. "Carrier," the veteran's voice cracked slightly. The explosion lit up the entire asteroid belt. Both ships were destroyed instantly, along with 3,000 souls. But in that moment, I understood something about humans that still terrifies me. She looked directly at each of the young recruits in turn. We won that battle. The asteroid belt fell, the human fleet was destroyed, and Earth's industrial capacity was crippled. But we had lost something more important than ships or soldiers. We had lost the initiative. Zixthara's final words carried the weight of absolute certainty. The humans had bought Earth 3 extra months to prepare their defenses and evacuate their civilians. 3 months that cost us everything, because in that time, Earth's remaining forces had learned from every mistake we had made. They had studied our tactics, analyzed our weaknesses, and prepared countermeasures that we couldn't imagine. The cantina remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the gentle hum of the station's recycling systems. The young Zephyrians looked at each other with new understanding, their romantic notions of warfare replaced by something closer to reality. Victory, Zixthara concluded, is not always about who wins the battle. Sometimes it's about who gets to choose the terms of the next one. The atmosphere in the cantina had shifted completely. What started as background chatter had become an eerie silence as aliens from dozen different species found themselves drawn to the veteran's words. A hulking Rigelian freighter captain had abandoned his card game to listen. Even the hooded figure in the corner had turned slightly, though their face remained hidden in shadow. Zixthara didn't notice the growing audience. Her 4 eyes stared into the empty glass, seeing ghosts that only she could perceive. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made the air itself feel heavy. After the asteroid belt, our high command thought they had broken human resistance, she began, her mandibles clicking nervously. We controlled their industrial centers. Their major colonies were under siege, and Earth itself was cut off from most of its allies. The war should have been over. She gestured to the bartender for another drink, her movements slow and deliberate. That's when the humans showed us what desperation really looked like. They called it Operation Prometheus, named after some mythological figure from their homeworld, a being who stole fire from the gods and gave it to mortals, knowing he would be punished for eternity. The young Zephyrian recruits exchanged nervous glances. Vexali, the youngest, spoke up hesitantly. What did they do? Zixthara's laugh was bitter and hollow. They weaponized everything, not just their military technology or their industrial capacity. They weaponized their culture, their biology, their psychology, their very humanity. Things that should never be used as weapons. The veteran took a long sip of her fresh drink before continuing. It started with intelligence operations that defied every convention of warfare. They had an officer named Jin Ho, a career intelligence specialist who volunteered for what everyone knew was a suicide mission. He allowed himself to be captured during a raid on one of their research facilities. Her voice dropped to barely, above a whisper. We thought we had struck gold. A high-ranking intelligence officer with access to Earth's defense plans, their fleet positions, everything we needed to end the war quickly. Our interrogation specialists were excited to begin their work. The recruits leaned forward, sensing that something terrible was coming. Jin Ho didn't resist the interrogation. In fact, he seemed almost eager to talk. He gave us detailed information about human troop movements, supply lines, and defensive positions. Everything checked out perfectly, too perfectly. Zixthara's claws scraped against the table. What we didn't know was that Jin Ho had infected himself with an engineered virus before his capture. Kirillon gasped. He used himself as a biological weapon. Not just any biological weapon, the veteran replied grimly. The humans had studied our genetics for months, mapping our DNA, understanding our cellular structure. The virus was designed specifically to target Keltharian physiology, while leaving other species completely unaffected. She paused, remembering the horror that followed. Jin-Ho died during the third day of interrogation, screaming in agony as the virus consumed his body from the inside. We thought his suffering was the result of our questioning techniques. We didn't realize that every breath he took, every drop of sweat that fell from his skin, was spreading death through our command ship. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the station's background systems seemed muted, as if the very machinery was listening to the tale. Within a week, the virus had spread through half our fleet. It was subtle at first, just fatigue and minor symptoms that could be attributed to combat stress. But then our soldiers started collapsing at their posts. Our pilots couldn't focus. During combat missions, our officers were making tactical errors that cost us entire battles. Zixthara's voice grew even quieter. The worst part was that we couldn't stop it. The virus was engineered to be dormant for days before showing symptoms, giving it time to spread throughout the fleet. By the time we realized what was happening, it was already too late. Jin-Ho had achieved more with his death than most generals, accomplished with entire armies. One of the recruits, Kekstar, spoke up nervously, but surely that was the worst of it. The veteran's mandibles clicked in what might have been dark amusement. That was just the beginning. While our fleet was dealing with the biological attack, the humans launched their psychological warfare campaign. They had a diplomat named Yun-Ju, a woman who understood alien psychology better than most aliens understood themselves. She took another drink, steeling herself for the next part of the story. Yun-Ju didn't use threats or bribes to turn our colonies against us. Instead, she used something far more powerful: empathy. She would arrive at Keltharian settlements with recordings of human civilians, particularly children, singing lullabies. To wounded alien prisoners of war, the recruits looked confused. Vexali tilted his head. Singing? How is that a weapon? Because it showed us something we didn't want to see, Zixthara explained. In those recordings, human children would sit beside injured Keltharian soldiers, singing soft melodies in languages they didn't understand. They would bring food to enemy prisoners, share their toys with wounded aliens, and treat our people with a kindness that made our own propaganda look like lies. Her voice grew heavy with emotion. Yun-Ju would show these recordings to our colonial administrators and ask them a simple question: is this the enemy you're fighting for? She didn't need to say anything else. The recordings spoke for themselves. The veteran's 4 eyes grew distant as she remembered. Entire colonies began to refuse their support for the war effort, not through rebellion or violence, but through passive resistance. They would delay supply shipments, provide incomplete intelligence reports, and gradually withdraw their cooperation with military operations. She clicked her mandibles sadly. The humans had turned our own capacity for empathy against us. They made us see them not as enemies to be destroyed, but as people to be protected. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated level. But the darkest part of the story was yet to come. Zixthara's expression grew grim as she approached the climax of Operation Prometheus. The final phase began when we cornered the last major human colony fleet at the Centauri system. 3 million civilians, mostly families fleeing the war zones, were trapped between our forces and the system's outer planets. We demanded their surrender, expecting the usual negotiations for safe passage. Her voice cracked slightly. Instead, the human commanders did something that still haunts our military academies. Rather than allow their people to be captured and used as leverage against Earth, they made an unthinkable choice. The silence in the cantina was absolute now. Even the station's ventilation system seemed to have quieted, as if the entire structure was holding its breath. They destroyed their own colonies, Zixthara whispered. Controlled nuclear detonations that vaporized entire settlements in seconds. Millions of human civilians died by their own leaders' hands rather than become prisoners of war. The recruits sat in stunned horror. The concept was so alien to their understanding that they could barely process it. The human commanders, officers like Captain Wu Jin and Commander Ye Jin, broadcast the final moments across the entire sector. They showed the galaxy exactly what lengths humans would go to, rather than submit to conquest. But more importantly, they showed what we had driven them to. Zixthara's voice grew stronger as she reached the conclusion of her tale. The recordings of those final moments spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. Species that had remained neutral suddenly saw us not as liberators or conquerors, but as monsters who forced parents to choose between slavery and death for their children. She drained her glass completely. Within months, the entire galactic community had turned against us. Trade routes were closed, diplomatic relations were severed, and our own allies began to question whether they were supporting the right side of the war. The veteran looked directly at each of the young recruits. The humans lost everything in Operation Prometheus, their colonies, their civilians, their industrial capacity, but they made sure that their losses came at a price we couldn't afford to pay. They chose to die free rather than live as slaves, and in doing so they made slavery itself seem like the greatest evil in the galaxy. Her final words carried the weight of absolute truth. That's when I learned the most important lesson about humans. They don't just fight with weapons or tactics or strategy. They fight with the very essence of what makes them human. And that, younglings, is something no amount of military superiority can overcome. The cantina remained silent for a long time after she finished speaking, the weight of her words settling over the assembled aliens like a heavy blanket. The young Zephyrians looked at each other with new eyes, their understanding of warfare forever changed by what they had heard. The cantina had become a temple of silence. Every alien in the establishment had abandoned their own conversations, their own concerns, their own problems to listen to the veteran's final tale. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as Zixthara prepared to share the memory that had changed everything she thought she knew about war, about enemies, and about the strange species called humanity. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. The young Zephyrian recruits had to lean forward, straining to catch every word that fell from her mandibles, like drops of liquid starlight. The war had been raging for 3 years when the universe decided to remind us all how small we really were. She began, her 4 eyes focused on something far beyond the cantina's metal walls. Our homeworld, Kelthar Prime, orbited a binary star system. Beautiful, stable, the kind of celestial dance that had lasted for millions of years. She paused, her claws tracing invisible patterns on the scarred table surface. Then the smaller star began to collapse, not gradually, not with the slow majesty that astronomers usually observe, but rapidly, violently. Within days it became clear that the resulting pulsar would bathe our entire system in gamma radiation, lethal to all organic life. The veteran's mandibles clicked nervously as she remembered the panic that had gripped her people. 42 billion Keltharians called the homeworld system home. 42 billion souls who had perhaps 72 hours before the radiation would begin cooking them alive. Every ship in the Empire was recalled, every transport vessel commandeered, every cargo hauler pressed into service as an evacuation craft. Vex Ali, the youngest recruit, spoke up in a voice tight with anticipation. But there weren't enough ships? Not even close, Zixthara confirmed grimly. We had maybe 30% of the transport capacity needed for a full evacuation, and half of our fleet was damaged from the ongoing war with the humans. Ships with broken engines, ruptured hulls, failing life support systems. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. 2/3 of our population was going to die. The cantina's lighting seemed to dim as she continued, though that might have been a trick of the smoke and shadows. The High Command sent out desperate calls for assistance to every neutral species in the sector. The Rigelians claimed they were too busy with their own territorial disputes. The Centaurians said they couldn't spare any vessels. The Altarians simply didn't respond to our transmissions. Her voice grew even quieter, forcing her audience to strain to hear. That's when the human fleet appeared at the edge of our system. 87 vessels, everything from massive hospital ships to tiny courier craft. They dropped out of hyperspace. In perfect formation, their weapons powered down, their shields lowered in a gesture of non-aggression. The veteran's shell began to shimmer with what looked like moisture, though Keltharians didn't cry in the same way humans did. The fleet was commanded by Admiral Kyung-Soo, a man whose name was carved into our intelligence files with letters of fire. He had lost his wife and 3 children when we bombed Lunar Colony in the early days of the war. His entire extended family, his childhood friends, his former colleagues, all dead because of Keltharian plasma bombardment. She took a shuddering breath. If anyone in the galaxy had earned the right to watch us die, it was him. He could have positioned his fleet just outside the radiation zone and watched 42 billion Keltharians burn. He could have called it justice, revenge, the settling of old debts. No one would have blamed him. The recruits were completely absorbed now, their bioluminescent patches pulsing in synchronized patterns of tension and anticipation. Around them, the other cantina patrons leaned forward, caught up in the story despite themselves. Instead, Zixthara continued, her voice cracking slightly. Admiral Kyung-Soo opened a channel to our evacuation command center. His face appeared on our screens, and I could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of his losses. But when he spoke, his voice was steady and calm. She paused, seeming to gather strength from some deep well of memory. He said, "Kelthar Prime Evacuation Command. This is Admiral Kyung-Soo of the Terran Emergency Response Fleet. We are here to assist with civilian evacuation operations. Please transmit your priority lists and coordinate with our medical teams. We have approximately 60 hours before the radiation becomes lethal." The silence that followed was profound. Even the station's mechanical systems seemed to have quieted, as if the very structure was listening to the tale. What followed was the most incredible display of coordination and compassion I had ever witnessed, the veteran continued. Human medical teams, led by doctors like Haiwan, worked around the clock treating Keltharian civilians who had been injured in the evacuation panic. These weren't soldiers or combatants. They were children, elderly citizens, pregnant mothers, who had never held a weapon in their lives. Her mandibles clicked in what might have been wonder or disbelief. Engineers like Minho and Subin worked 30-hour shifts without rest, repairing damaged Keltharian evacuation vessels with human spare parts and human expertise. They welded hull breaches, restored life support systems, and jury-rigged engines. That should have been scrap metal into functional spacecraft. Zixthara touched a long scar that ran across her thorax, a pale line against her dark, chitinous shell. I was wounded during the evacuation chaos. A support beam fell during the loading of a transport ship, crushing my exoskeleton and rupturing several internal organs. I should have died there, just another casualty of cosmic bad luck. Her voice grew softer, more personal. Instead, I found myself on a human medical ship, being treated by a surgeon named Dr. Young-hee. She was young, maybe 30 standard years, with steady hands and eyes that held both determination and compassion. For 16 hours, she worked to repair the damage to my body, using techniques that bridged the gap between human and Keltharian physiology. The veteran's 4 eyes seemed to glow brighter as she remembered. Halfway through the surgery, the final evacuation order came through. The radiation levels were climbing faster than predicted, and all non-essential personnel needed to evacuate immediately. Dr. Young-hee's own medical team was ordered to abandon the ship and transfer to a faster vessel. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. But she refused to leave. She told her commanding officer that she had a patient on the table and that she would finish the surgery no matter what. When they tried to order her to evacuate, she simply turned off her comm unit and continued working. The recruits sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what they were hearing. Around them, the cantina had become a cathedral of attention. Every being present focused on the veteran's words. As our transport lifted off from the medical ship, I watched through the viewport as human volunteers stayed behind to help with the final evacuations. Zixthara continued. Technicians who could have been safely aboard evacuation vessels remained to operate the transport systems. Pilots who could have escaped stayed to ferry the last groups of civilians to safety. Medical personnel who could have been light years away continued treating the wounded until the very last moment. Her voice grew stronger, more certain. Some of them didn't make it out. When the radiation finally spiked, there were still human volunteers on the surface, still helping with the evacuation of Keltharian families. They knew they were going to die, but they stayed anyway. The veteran stood slowly, her old wounds protesting the movement. Her 4 eyes swept across the assembled recruits, taking in their expressions of awe, confusion, and something approaching fear. "That's when I understood the truth about humans," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. They don't just fight harder than anyone else. They love harder too. They can show mercy to their enemies, compassion to those who have wronged them, and sacrifice for those who would have left them to die. She reached into her utility pouch and placed a small stack of credits on the table, enough to cover her drinks and a generous tip for the bartender who had kept them coming without question. That's what makes them truly terrifying younglings, she concluded, her mandibles clicking one final time. They can show you mercy when you least deserve it, and that mercy will haunt you for the rest of your life. Because once you've seen what humans are capable of, once you've experienced their capacity for both destruction and compassion, you can never again pretend that the universe is a simple place with simple answers. Zixthara turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The recruits remained at the table, staring at the empty glass she had left behind, their minds struggling to process everything they had heard. Slowly, gradually, the cantina began to return to its normal chaos. Conversations resumed, games were restarted, and the business of 100 different species continued. But the young Zephyrians remained silent, their bioluminescent patches pulsing in slow, thoughtful patterns. They had come to the cantina looking for stories of glory and heroism, tales of victory and conquest that would prepare them for their own military service. Instead, they had received something far more valuable and far more dangerous, the understanding that warfare was not just about victory or defeat, but about what you chose to become in the darkness between peace and war. As they finally rose to leave, preparing for their deployment to the outer rim, each of them carried with them the weight of Zixthara's words. They would never again see conflict as a simple matter of us versus them, good versus evil, victory versus defeat. They had learned that the most dangerous enemies were often those who could show mercy to their foes, and that the greatest victories were sometimes won not through strength or cunning, but through the simple act of choosing compassion over revenge. In a galaxy full of weapons and warriors, technologies and tactics, the humans had found something more powerful than any plasma rifle or fusion bomb: the ability to transform their enemies into allies through the simple act of treating them as people worthy of salvation. The cantina door hissed shut behind the departing recruits, and the station continued its eternal orbit around the distant star. But the story would travel with them, spreading from ship to ship, world to world, species to species, until it became part of the galaxy's collective memory. And in the depths of space, where the darkness between stars held secrets that could reshape entire civilizations, the tale of human mercy would continue to echo, a testament to the power of choosing love over hate, even in the midst of war. The end.